In the final hours before a city woke, before the merchants arranged their figs, and the potters fired their kilns, and the democratic machinery of the ancient world ground back into motion, a man sat in a stone room and waited to die for asking questions. The cell exists in the archaeological record as a set of foundations, rough limestone blocks mortared with clay, the outline of a rectangular space, no larger than a modest modern bathroom, located near the southwest corner of the Athenian Agora, where excavations have tentatively identified the remains of the state prison known as the Desmoteria. But to stand at those foundations and imagine the morning of 399 BCE is to feel something that transcends archaeology. It is to feel the specific weight of a civilization passing judgment on its own conscience. The walls of that cell would have been rough-hewn limestone, the kind quarried from the hills of Attica and stacked without the refinement reserved for temples and civic monuments. In the hours before dawn, those walls sweat with moisture, the particular dampness of Mediterranean stone in the early morning, when the temperature drops and the rock exhales the cold it has absorbed through the night. The surface would have been uneven, pocked with the natural irregularities of the stone, and marked in places with the scratched graffiti of former occupants. Names, symbols, the desperate record of those who had passed through this space before and left their mark in the only way available to them. A narrow window slot, positioned high in the eastern wall, admitted the first pale thread of Aegean light. Not a window in any generous sense, rather an architectural concession to the minimum requirements of human habitation, a gap in the stone barely wide enough to admit a hand. Through it, in the hour before sunrise, the sky above Athens would have been the deep indigo that precedes dawn in the eastern Mediterranean, a color so saturated it seems almost solid. The last stars of the Pleiades, still visible near the horizon before the advancing light, erased them. On a stone ledge beside a bed of straw rested a clay cup. Simple, undecorated, the kind of vessel produced by the thousands in the workshops of the Kerameikos district, a utilitarian object, fired at low temperature, its surface the warm terracotta color of Attic soil. It was empty. It would not remain empty for long. The documentary eye moves slowly through this space, cataloguing its surfaces with the patience of an archaeologist and the attention of a mourner. The iron ring bolted into the floor, its purpose self-evident, its surface reddened with the oxidation of centuries. The shallow groove worn into the threshold stone by countless shuffling feet, the accumulated passage of the condemned leaving their physical trace in the hardest material available. The straw of the sleeping pallet, dry and faintly aromatic, the smell of the Attic countryside carried into this most urban of spaces. The single wooden stool. The ceramic water jug, its handle repaired with a band of lead. Every object in this room is a document, and every document tells the same story. This is a place where the city keeps those it has decided to discard. Outside the barred window, Athens was stirring. The Agora, the great civic marketplace that served as the beating heart of Athenian democratic life, was assembling itself in the pre-dawn darkness. The distant clatter of wooden market stalls being erected, the creak of cart wheels on the packed earth roads, the low voices of vendors arranging their goods by lamplight. The smell of olive wood smoke rising from household hearths throughout the lower city, the particular blue-gray quality of that smoke in cold morning air, drifting upward through the terracotta rooftops and dispersing into the brightening sky. And above everything, catching the very first rays of the rising sun before any other structure in the city, the marble columns of the Parthenon on the Acropolis, that limestone plateau rising sharply above the urban fabric below, the temple's Doric columns beginning to glow with the faint pink warmth of early light, while the city beneath remained in shadow. This is the central image of what follows: a civilization at its most glorious peak, and a single dark room within it where the price of asking questions is being paid. Athens in 399 BCE was, by any measure available to the ancient world, extraordinary. Its democratic institutions, established roughly a century earlier and reformed repeatedly in the intervening decades, represented an experiment in collective self-governance without precedent in recorded history. Its artistic and architectural achievements, the Parthenon completed just 3 decades prior, the sculptures of Pheidias, the tragedies of Sophocles and Euripides, the comedies of Aristophanes, had produced a cultural legacy that would shape Western civilization for the next 2.5 millennia. Its naval power had helped defeat the Persian Empire. Its philosophical tradition was in the process of asking questions that human beings are still attempting to answer. And in a stone cell near the southwest corner of its greatest public space, the man most responsible for the sharpest and most penetrating of those questions was waiting for the sun to rise on his last day. The hemlock plant grows throughout the Mediterranean world, and it grows abundantly in Attica. Along stream banks, in disturbed ground near roadsides, in the margins between cultivated fields and wild hillside. Its appearance is deceptive in the way that many dangerous things are deceptive. Feathery white flower clusters arranged in delicate umbels, hollow stems streaked with purple-red markings, leaves of a soft and almost domestic green. It resembles plants that are entirely harmless: wild carrot, fennel, the various umbellifers that grow throughout the region. The ancient Greeks knew it as conian, and they knew its properties with the precision that comes from long and careful observation. The alkaloid compounds concentrated in its stems and seeds, conine and related substances, act on the nervous system with a methodical and ascending paralysis, beginning at the extremities and moving inward toward the vital organs. It is, in the clinical language of toxicology, a neuromuscular blocking agent. In the language of 399 BCE Athens, it was the instrument of state execution, the mechanism by which the city disposed of those it had formerly condemned. That the most sophisticated democracy the ancient world had yet produced chose poison as its method of execution is itself a kind of philosophical statement. There is no violence in it, no blood, no spectacle of physical force. The condemned drinks, and then the condemned waits, and then the condemned dies. It is, in its terrible way, a civilized method, which is precisely what makes it so disturbing. The civilization that produced the Parthenon and the Symposium and the concept of democratic accountability also produced this. A cup of poison administered in a stone room, the final argument in a debate that had lasted a lifetime. The narrator's eye returns to the window slot in the eastern wall. The sky beyond has shifted, the deep indigo giving way to the first pale grey of pre-dawn, then to a thin line of gold along the horizon above the hills of Attica. The Parthenon's columns are now clearly visible, their marble surfaces warming from pink to the full gold of early morning. The sounds of the agora below are louder now, more various, the bleating of animals being led to market, the sharp voices of vendors calling to one another across the open space, the rhythmic hammering of a bronze worker beginning his day in the workshops along the agora's southern edge. The city is awake, the city is alive, the city is conducting its business with the unself-conscious energy of a place that believes in its own permanence. In the cell, the clay cup sits on its stone ledge, empty, waiting. The most dangerous thing in Athens in 399 BCE was not a weapon. It was not a sword or a spear or the bronze-tipped ram of a trireme. It was a word. More precisely, it was a question, the kind of question that once asked cannot be unasked, that opens a space in the mind where certainty used to live and replaces it with the uncomfortable, productive, destabilizing presence of doubt. The kind of question that a 70-year-old man with a snub nose and bare feet had been asking in the streets and the marketplace and the gymnasium of Athens for the better part of 4 decades. What is justice? What is courage? What is piety? What is knowledge? What is the good life, and how does one live it? These are not questions with answers that can be purchased from a sophist, memorized from a text, or inherited from tradition. They are questions that require the questioner to examine their own assumptions, to follow the argument wherever it leads regardless of social comfort, to acknowledge ignorance as the beginning of wisdom rather than its absence. For this, the city of Athens had voted, by a margin of 280 to 221, according to the ancient sources, to condemn Socrates to death. The cell's silence is absolute in the moment before the city fully wakes. It is the silence of examined thought, the quiet that exists at the center of a question that has not yet been answered, the pause between the asking and the knowing. Outside, the noise of the world continues its ancient business. Inside, in the cold and the dark and the moisture of the limestone walls, something else is happening. Something that will outlast the city, outlast the empire that will eventually absorb it, outlast the religions that will build their cathedrals over its temples, outlast the centuries of forgetting and rediscovery and reinterpretation that constitute the long afterlife of ideas. The sun clears the hills of Attica. The first full ray of morning light enters through the window slot and falls across the stone ledge. It illuminates the clay cup. It illuminates the rough surface of the wall. It illuminates the worn groove in the threshold stone, the iron ring in the floor, the dry straw of the pallet. Athens is fully awake now. The agora is in full voice. The Acropolis blazes white and gold above the city. The silver-grey olive groves of Attica stretch to every horizon, and the wine-dark waters of the Saronic Gulf shimmer to the south, and the air smells of smoke and bread, and the particular mineral clarity of an Aegean morning. In the cell, a man who spent his life asking what it means to live well is about to demonstrate, in the most unambiguous terms available, what it means to die well. The cup is still empty. The city is still waking. The question is still hanging in the air, unanswered, as it has always been and as it always will be, the most dangerous, the most necessary, the most fundamentally human thing that one person can offer another. Not a sword, not a weapon. A question, and the morning light falls across the stone, and the city moves, and the cup waits. To understand what Athens condemned in that prison cell, one must first understand what Athens was, not as an abstraction of historical memory, but as a breathing, smelling, clattering, arguing physical reality. Step out of the desmoteria and into the morning light of the 5th century BCE, and the city that surrounds you is unlike anything the ancient world had yet produced. It is a place that seems, in its very stones and spaces, to have been designed by the act of thinking itself. The Acropolis announces itself before anything else. From virtually every point in the lower city, that limestone plateau dominates the visual field, a natural fortress rising roughly 150 meters above the surrounding plain. Its vertical rock face is worn smooth by millennia of wind and rain. Its summit crowned with structures of such calculated perfection that they appear less built than crystallized from the air itself. The Parthenon, completed in 432 BCE under the direction of the sculptor Pheidias and the architects Ictinos and Callicrates, stands at the plateau's highest point, its Doric columns of pentelic marble gleaming white and ochre in the full morning sun. The marble of Pentelicon, quarried from the mountain of that name, roughly 16 kilometers northeast of the city, contains trace deposits of iron that cause it to warm gradually over time from brilliant white to the honey gold visible in the surviving columns today. In the 5th century BCE, freshly cut and polished, it would have been almost painfully bright in the Attic sun, a beacon of civic achievement visible from the surrounding countryside and from the sea. The colossal bronze statue of Athene Promachus, Athene the champion, stood between the Propylaea gateway and the Parthenon, its scale so vast that ancient sources record the tip of her spear and the crest of her helmet were visible to sailors approaching from the harbor at Piraeus, roughly 8 kilometers to the southwest. The statue no longer exists, melted down in later centuries, but its base has been identified in the archaeological record, and from that base, the scale can be reconstructed. A figure approximately 9 meters tall, cast in bronze, the goddess in full armor with spear raised, her presence transforming the Acropolis from a religious precinct into something closer to a declaration, a statement in metal and stone about what this city believed itself to be. The Propylaea, the monumental gateway through which one ascended to the Acropolis summit, was itself a masterwork of architectural theater. Its approach involved a deliberate sequence of compression and expansion, the visitor climbing the sacred way through increasingly imposing architecture, passing through the gateway's central passage, with its columns pressing close on either side, and then emerging suddenly onto the plateau with the full panorama of the Parthenon and the city below revealed simultaneously. This was not accidental. The architects of Golden Age Athens understood that space itself could be an argument, that the physical experience of moving through a building could produce specific emotional and intellectual states. The Acropolis was designed to overwhelm, to humble, to inspire, and in doing so, to remind every citizen of Athens what their collective achievement looked like rendered in marble and bronze. From the heights, the lower city spreads in every direction. To the northwest, the Kerameikos district, named for the potters whose workshops lined its streets, occupied the ground on either side of the Dipylon Gate, the great double gateway through which the main road from the north entered the city. The potters of the Kerameikos produced the black figure and red figure pottery, for which Athens was famous throughout the Mediterranean world, and the district's air would have been permanently hazed with the smoke of kilns, the clay-scented dust of the workshops drifting through the narrow streets. Adjacent to the Potter's Quarter and separated from it by the city wall lay the great cemetery of Athens, also called the Kerameikos, where the road to the academy ran between rows of stone grave monuments, the stelae carved with relief portraits of the dead, their painted surfaces fading but still vivid in the 5th century, the faces of Athenian citizens looking out from the stone with an intimacy that crosses the millennia. The residential neighborhoods of the lower city were a labyrinth by any modern standard, narrow alleys of packed earth, the upper stories of mud brick houses leaning toward each other until the sky above was reduced to a thin strip of blue, the terracotta roof tiles nearly touching overhead. The streets followed no grid, no plan, no organizing principle beyond the accumulated decisions of generations of builders working around each other's walls and wells and property boundaries. In the summer heat, these alleys would have been dim and relatively cool, the thick mud brick walls absorbing the sun's energy and releasing it slowly through the night. The smells were complex and inseparable. Tanning leather from the workshops, baking bread from the household ovens, the sharp ammonia of the fullers who cleaned wool with fermented urine, the sweet decay of organic waste in the open drainage channels, the resinous smoke of pine torches at night. This was the Athens that Socrates walked daily, not the marble perfection of the Acropolis, but the human-scaled, sensory-saturated environment of the streets. And then there was the Agora. If the Acropolis was Athens looking upward at its own ideals, the Agora was Athens looking at itself with clear and sometimes uncomfortable eyes. The great civic marketplace occupied a roughly rectangular space northwest of the Acropolis, its boundaries marked by boundary stones inscribed with the words that translated as, "I am the boundary of the Agora." A declaration that this space was set apart from the ordinary city, governed by its own rules, dedicated to its own purposes. Those purposes were multiple and overlapping in a way that no modern equivalent quite captures. The Agora was simultaneously a marketplace, a courthouse, a council chamber, a religious precinct, a place of public assembly, and crucially, a place of philosophical encounter. The Stoa of Zeus Eleutherios, Zeus the Liberator, ran along the western edge of the Agora, its painted porticos offering shade and shelter for the conversations that Socrates favored. The Stoa as an architectural form was itself a philosophical gift. A long, covered walkway, open on one side to the public space, providing protection from sun and rain while maintaining connection to the civic world outside. Ancient sources identify the area near this Stoa as a location particularly associated with Socratic conversation, and it is easy to understand why. The combination of shade, shelter, and visibility, the ability to watch the Agora's activity while remaining slightly removed from it, made it an ideal environment for the kind of extended, unhurried dialogue that Socratic method required. The circular tholos, where the executive committee of the Athenian council ate and slept during their term of service, stood nearby, a building whose very shape embodied democratic principle, its circular form placing all occupants in equal relation to the center. The Bouleuterion, the council chamber where 500 citizens deliberated on the city's affairs, occupied the western edge of the Agora, its stone benches arranged to face a central speaker's position. The law courts, multiple enclosures of varying sizes, were distributed across the Agora's space, their wooden barriers and stone boundary markers defining temporary zones of legal authority within the larger civic space. The physical apparatus of Athenian democracy was everywhere visible in the Agora, and it was, by any measure, remarkable. The Kleroterion, a bronze allotment machine used to randomly assign citizens to jury duty and other civic functions, represented a mechanical embodiment of democratic principle, its rows of slots and bronze balls ensuring that the selection of jurors was genuinely random, genuinely beyond manipulation. The clepsydra, the water clock used to measure speaking time in the courts, imposed an egalitarian discipline on public discourse. Every speaker received the same measured quantity of time, the water draining at the same rate regardless of the speaker's wealth or status. These were not merely administrative devices. They were philosophical statements rendered in bronze and terracotta, the physical expression of a belief that civic equality could be engineered into the environment itself. The bronze statues of the tyrannicides, Harmodios and Aristogiton, who had killed the tyrant Hipparchos in 514 BCE, stood in the Agora as the city's most powerful civic icons, their poses of violent action frozen in metal as a permanent reminder of what democracy had cost, and what it required of its citizens. Around them, the Hermes statues, rectangular stone pillars topped with the bearded head of Hermes, their surfaces worn smooth by the hands of passers-by who touched them for luck, stood at crossroads and entrances throughout the agora, their worn surfaces testifying to the accumulated touch of generations. Beyond the city's boundaries, the landscape of Attica extended in every direction with a beauty that was inseparable from the intellectual character of the civilization it supported. The silver-gray olive groves stretched to every horizon, ancient trees, many of them centuries old, even in the 5th century BCE, their twisted trunks and shimmering leaves creating a landscape of extraordinary visual complexity, the light filtering through the canopy in patterns that changed with every shift of the Aegean breeze. The olive was not merely an agricultural product in Attica. It was a sacred tree, associated with Athene herself, its cultivation intertwined with Athenian identity at the deepest level. The sacred olive trees on the Acropolis, grown from cuttings of the original tree that Athene had caused to spring from the rock in her contest with Poseidon, were tended with religious care, their continued existence understood as a guarantee of divine favor. Mount Hymettus rose to the east of the city, its limestone slopes flushed pink at dusk and dawn, its summit frequently wreathed in the clouds that gave it a quality of mystery even in the clear Attic atmosphere. The mountain was famous for its honey, the thyme that grew on its slopes producing a honey of exceptional flavor, golden and aromatic, traded throughout the Mediterranean world. To the south, the Saronic Gulf shimmered in the afternoon light, its waters the deep blue-green that Homer had called wine dark, the island of Aegina visible on clear days as a low dark shape on the horizon, the more distant mountains of the Peloponnese rising beyond. This was the physical world that produced Socratic philosophy, not despite its beauty and complexity, but because of it. Athens in the Golden Age was a city that had achieved sufficient material prosperity, sufficient political stability, and sufficient cultural confidence to turn its collective attention to questions that had no immediate practical application. What is justice? What is the good life? These are not questions that a city asks when it is struggling to survive. They are questions that a city asks when it has built the Parthenon and defeated Persia and established democratic institutions, and found, in the midst of all that achievement, that it still does not know what it is for. The city of marble and argument had created, in its very physical structure, the conditions for philosophical inquiry. Its open spaces invited gathering. Its colonnaded stoas provided shelter for extended conversation. Its democratic institutions required citizens to think about justice and governance as practical daily concerns rather than abstract ideals. Its religious traditions raised questions about the nature of the divine that could not be answered by simple piety. Its theatrical performances, the great tragedies performed at the festival of Dionysus each spring, in the theater cut into the southern slope of the Acropolis, staged the deepest questions of human existence before audiences of thousands, making philosophy a civic experience rather than a private one. And through all of it, a barefoot man with a snub nose walked the streets and the stoas and the gymnasium paths, asking questions that the city's marble and bronze and terracotta could not answer. The physical environment of Athens had created the conditions for Socratic philosophy. It had also, in ways that would take decades to fully manifest, created the conditions for the Hemlock Cup. The same democracy that built the Tholos and the Cleroterion and the painted stoas would eventually vote, by a margin of 59, to silence the most persistent questioner it had produced. The morning light falls across the agora. The columns of the Parthenon blaze white against the blue Attic sky. The olive groves of Attica shimmer to the horizon. The city argues with itself, as it always has, as it always will, the argument that is, perhaps, the most enduring thing it ever built. Before Socrates walked barefoot through the agora, asking what justice meant, other men stood at the edges of other landscapes and asked different questions entirely. Questions directed not inward at the human soul, but outward at the fabric of the cosmos itself. To understand what Socrates transformed, one must first travel to the places where that transformation had its origins, to the coastlines and volcanic fields and temple-lined streets, where the Western philosophical tradition first drew breath. The journey begins at the sea. Miletus in Ionia, located on the western coast of what is now Turkey, where the Meander River meets the Aegean, was in the 6th century BCE one of the most prosperous and cosmopolitan cities in the Greek world. Its harbor opened onto the broad Aegean, and through that harbor passed the trade goods and ideas of Egypt, Persia, Phoenicia, and the Black Sea colonies. The physical environment of Miletus was defined by water in a way that few ancient cities could match. The Meander River, whose very name would eventually become a word for winding, wandering movement, deposited its sediment in vast tidal flats around the city's approaches, creating a landscape of extraordinary fluidity where the boundary between land and sea was never quite fixed, where the ground itself seemed to be in the process of becoming something else. River deltas spread their fingers into the shallow coastal waters. Seasonal floods transformed solid ground into temporary lakes. The sea itself was always present, always audible, always shaping the sensory world of anyone who lived and thought within its reach. It was in this environment that Thales of Miletus, active in the early 6th century BCE, proposed something that sounds simple and is, in fact, revolutionary: that all things are fundamentally made of water. The proposition seems almost naive when stripped of its context, but placed back into the landscape of Miletus. The tidal flats, the river deltas, the constant cycling of water through its various states, the way that moisture seemed to underlie every living thing. It reveals itself as a serious attempt to find a single unifying principle beneath the apparent diversity of the physical world. Thales was not making a poetic observation. He was doing something that had never quite been done before, proposing a rational, naturalistic explanation for the structure of reality, one that required no divine intervention, no mythological narrative, no appeal to the arbitrary will of the gods. He was, in the most fundamental sense, doing philosophy. The significance of this cannot be overstated. Before Thales, the Greek world explained natural phenomena through mythology. Thunder was Zeus, the sea was Poseidon, the earth's stability depended on divine will. Thales proposed that the world could be explained through the world itself, that the same substance visible in the tidal flats of Miletus was the fundamental constituent of everything that existed. The environment had, in a very real sense, suggested the idea, and the idea had changed everything. Thales was not alone. The Milesian school, if it can be called a school, produced Anaximander, who proposed that the fundamental substance was not water or any identifiable element, but something he called the apeiron, the boundless or indefinite, an abstract principle from which all specific things emerged, and to which they returned. And Anaximenes, who proposed air as the fundamental substance, its condensation and rarefaction producing the full range of physical phenomena. These three thinkers, working within a few decades of each other in the same coastal city, established the basic framework of naturalistic inquiry that would define pre-Socratic philosophy. The conviction that the cosmos operates according to discoverable principles, that those principles are accessible to human reason, and that the proper response to the world's complexity is not myth but investigation. From Miletus, the philosophical gaze moves southwest and west, following the trade routes that carried ideas as surely as they carried grain and olive oil. The island of Samos, visible from the Ionian coast on clear days, produced Pythagoras, or rather, produced the man who would eventually leave Samos and travel to the Greek colonies of southern Italy, where he established the community at Croton that would bear his philosophical legacy. The physical environment of Croton, on the toe of the Italian peninsula, was one of ordered agricultural prosperity. The geometric regularity of its temple architecture, the precise ratios of its colonnades, the carefully maintained rows of its olive groves, suggesting a landscape that had been organized according to rational principles. It was here, in this environment of mathematical order, that the Pythagorean tradition developed its central insight. That number was the fundamental reality underlying all things, that the cosmos was structured according to mathematical relationships that could be discovered and expressed with precision. The Pythagorean tradition introduced something new into the philosophical conversation: the idea that the most important truths about reality were not material but abstract, not visible to the eye but accessible to the mind. The discovery, attributed to the Pythagorean school, that the musical intervals of the octave, the fifth, and the fourth corresponded to simple numerical ratios, represented a moment of extraordinary intellectual excitement, a demonstration that the invisible structure of reality could be expressed in numbers. The physical world of Croton, its temples, its proportioned spaces, its agricultural geometry, embodied this conviction in stone and soil. The journey continues westward to Sicily, where the philosophical tradition encountered a landscape of raw geological drama that would leave its mark on the ideas produced within it. The volcanic terrain of eastern Sicily, dominated by the massive presence of Mount Etna, was in the 5th century BCE a landscape of visible elemental force. Sulfurous vents exhaled their mineral breath from fissures in the rock. Lava fields of black basalt stretched across the lower slopes, their surfaces broken and jagged, the record of ancient eruptions preserved in stone. The sea crashed against cliffs of volcanic rock, and the air carried the sharp mineral smell of the Earth's interior. This was the world of Empedocles of Acragas, the Sicilian philosopher who proposed that all matter was composed of 4 fundamental elements: earth, water, fire, and air, combined and separated by the forces he called love and strife. The landscape of Sicily made Empedocles' theory feel almost inevitable. Here were the 4 elements in their most dramatic and undeniable forms: the solid earth of the volcanic rock, the water of the surrounding sea, the fire of Etna's eruptions, the air of the Sicilian winds that swept across the island with enough force to shape the landscape itself. Empedocles was not simply observing his environment and transcribing it into philosophy, but the environment was providing him with the raw material of intuition, the sensory foundation upon which abstract reasoning could build. The volcanic drama of Sicily was thinking through him, in some sense, just as the tidal flats of Miletus had thought through Thales. Ancient sources record that Empedocles was a figure of extraordinary charisma and ambition, a healer and a wonder worker, as well as a philosopher, who reportedly claimed divine status and whose death was surrounded by legend. One tradition held that he threw himself into the crater of Etna to prove his immortality, a story almost certainly apocryphal, but one that captures something true about the relationship between this thinker and his volcanic landscape. The mountain was not merely a backdrop for Empedocles. It was, in some sense, his philosophical partner. The documentary's gaze sweeps back across the Aegean toward Athens, following the ideas that traveled with the traders and the travelers and the wandering sophists who carried philosophical arguments from city to city like goods in a merchant's pack. By the mid-5th century BCE, Athens had become the destination for the most ambitious and intellectually adventurous minds in the Greek world. The city's wealth, its democratic culture, its appetite for novelty and argument made it a natural center for the philosophical tradition that had been developing on the periphery of the Greek world for more than a century. The sophists arrived in Athens with their portable philosophical schools, their canvas awnings erected in the gathering places outside the city walls, their paid lectures drawing crowds of wealthy young men eager to acquire the rhetorical skills that democratic Athens rewarded. These were the prototypes of philosophical education in Athens: temporary, commercial, transactional. The sophist Protagoras, who reportedly charged substantial fees for his instruction, is associated with the famous proposition that man is the measure of all things, a statement that shifted the philosophical focus from the cosmos to the human observer, from the question of what the world is made of to the question of how human beings perceive and judge it. This shift was crucial. It prepared the ground for Socrates, even as Socrates would reject the sophistic method in almost every other respect. The wealthy private homes of Athens, with their shaded interior courtyards and their tradition of the symposium, the formal drinking party that served as the primary venue for intellectual exchange among the Athenian elite, provided another kind of philosophical space. Here, reclining on cushioned couches around the walls of the Andron, the men's dining room, Athenian citizens and their guests debated the ideas that the sophists had introduced and the pre-Socratic tradition had generated. The physical environment of the symposium, intimate, enclosed, lubricated by wine, governed by its own elaborate social rituals, produced a different kind of philosophical conversation than the open-air exchanges of the agora. More personal, more competitive, more concerned with the social implications of ideas. The distinction that the pre-Socratic tradition and the Athenian philosophical environment together established was one of orientation. The thinkers of Miletus and Croton and Acragas had looked outward, at the sea, at the elements, at the mathematical structure of the cosmos. Their world was the sky, the sea, the geological drama of the Earth's surface. Their questions were about the nature of physical reality, the composition of matter, the structure of the universe. These were questions of enormous importance, questions that would eventually generate the entire tradition of natural science. But they were not, in the end, the questions that would prove most dangerous in Athens. Socrates would look inward. His world would be the street, the marketplace, the gymnasium path, the human-scaled environment of the polis. His questions would be about justice and courage and piety and knowledge, not what the world is made of, but how human beings should live within it. This was the transformation that the pre-Socratic tradition had made possible and that Socrates would complete. The philosophical gaze, having swept across the tidal flats of Miletus and the volcanic fields of Sicily and the geometric perfection of Croton, would finally come to rest on the most complex and intractable subject available to human inquiry. Not the cosmos, the self. The rocky coastline of Ionia recedes into the distance. The volcanic landscape of Sicily cools. The mathematical perfection of Croton's colonnades stands silent in the Italian afternoon. And in Athens, in the streets and the stowers and the sunlit spaces of the agora, a barefoot man is beginning to ask the questions that will cost him everything, questions that the entire pre-Socratic tradition had been, without quite knowing it, preparing the ground for all along. There is a boundary stone in Athens, recovered from the earth by archaeologists and now displayed in the Agora Museum, inscribed with words that translate with simple authority as "I am the boundary of the Agora." The stone is not large. It is not impressive by the standards of Athenian civic monuments, but the declaration carved into its surface contains within it the entire philosophical world of Socrates, because what the stone marks is not merely a legal boundary or an administrative designation. It marks the edge of the most important open-air classroom the Western world has ever known. To enter the agora in full daylight, at the height of an Attic summer, is to enter a sensory environment of extraordinary intensity. The packed earth of its central open space, baked hard by months of sun and worn smooth by the passage of thousands of feet, radiates heat upward in visible waves by mid-morning. The limestone dust raised by that passage hangs in the air, giving the light a particular quality, slightly diffuse, slightly golden, the kind of light that softens edges and makes everything visible while making nothing entirely sharp. The sky above is the deep, saturated blue of the Aegean summer, a blue so consistent and so intense that it functions almost as a ceiling, pressing down on the open space with a weight of color that the eye registers as physical presence. The sounds arrive before the sights when approaching from the city's residential quarters. The agora announces itself orally, a rising complexity of human noise that builds as one approaches, resolving gradually from undifferentiated urban clamor into its constituent elements. The rhythmic hammering of bronze workers from the workshops along the agora's southern edge, a sound that carries above all others, metallic and percussive, marking the hours with its steady beat. The calls of vendors, each with their particular pitch and rhythm, advertising fish sauce and fresh herbs and dried figs, and the small terracotta oil lamps that every household required. The sound of animals, the bleating of sheep being led to the sacrificial altars of the nearby temples, the occasional bray of a donkey loaded with goods, the persistent cooing of pigeons in the eaves of the stowers. And beneath all of it, the continuous low murmur of human conversation, hundreds of simultaneous exchanges, the democratic city talking to itself in the space it had set aside for exactly that purpose. The smell of the agora is equally complex and equally insistent. Fish sauce, garum, the fermented fish condiment that served as the primary flavoring agent in Athenian cooking, has a smell that penetrates everything within its vicinity, a sharp, oceanic, slightly putrefying odor that the ancient Athenians apparently found entirely appetizing. Fresh herbs from the food vendors, thyme and oregano and bay, their volatile oils released by the morning sun, cutting through the heavier smells with a clean, resinous sharpness. The smell of freshly baked bread from the vendors who sold it warm in the morning hours. The mineral smell of the limestone dust. The animal smell of the livestock. The human smell of a large crowd in a warm climate before the era of any systematic sanitation. The agora was not a pleasant environment by modern standards of sensory comfort. It was a vivid one, a place where the senses were continuously engaged, where the physical world pressed itself upon consciousness with an insistence that made abstract thought both more difficult and perhaps more necessary. Moving through the agora's space with the attention of an archaeologist and the patience of a philosopher, the specific zones of this environment reveal themselves with increasing clarity. The western edge of the agora was defined by a series of civic buildings whose functions embodied the democratic principles that Athens had been refining for a century. The Bouleuterion, the council chamber where 500 citizens, selected annually by lot from the 10 tribes of Athens, deliberated on the legislation and administration of the city, occupied a position of architectural authority on this western slope. Its interior was arranged with stone benches in concentric semicircular rows, the arrangement placing every council member in equal visual relation to the speaker's position at the center. The building's exterior was unassuming by the standards of Athenian civic architecture. No elaborate sculptural program, no painted porticos, because its significance was entirely interior, entirely functional, entirely about the process that took place within its walls rather than the impression it made from without. Adjacent to the Bouleuterion stood the Tholos, the circular building where the executive committee of the council, the Prytanes, 50 men who served in rotation throughout the year, ate and slept during their term of service, ensuring that the city's government was never without its executive body. The Tholos was a building of genuine architectural distinction, its circular form unusual in a tradition that favored rectangular plans, its conical roof visible above the surrounding structures. Archaeological excavations have recovered from its floor the remains of the meals consumed there: animal bones, fish scales, olive pits, grape seeds. The dietary record of Athenian democratic governance preserved in the soil for 2.5 millennia. These are not glamorous artifacts, but they are intimate ones, connecting the abstract machinery of democracy to the physical reality of human beings eating their dinner in a round building on a summer evening, the sounds of the agora drifting through the open doorway. The Herm statues that stood at the agora's entrances and crossroads were among its most distinctive physical features. These rectangular stone pillars, their shafts uncarved, their surfaces left rough, were topped with the bearded head of Hermes, the god of travelers, boundaries, and communication, and equipped with erect male genitalia at the appropriate height. The combination seems jarring to modern sensibilities, but to the ancient Athenian, the Herm was a completely natural presence at every threshold and crossroads, a marker of transition, a guardian of passage, an object of casual daily devotion. The surfaces of the Herms in the agora were worn smooth by the hands of passers-by who touched them for luck, for protection, for the simple human comfort of contact with something sacred in the midst of the ordinary. In 415 BCE, on the night before the great Athenian fleet departed for the disastrous Sicilian expedition, unknown persons mutilated the Herms throughout the city, knocking off their faces, defacing their surfaces. The scandal that followed nearly tore Athens apart, demonstrating how deeply these modest stone pillars were embedded in the city's sense of its own sacred order. The fountain houses of the agora deserve particular attention in any account of Socratic philosophy, because they represent one of the spaces where philosophical conversation was most naturally and most democratically available. The fountain houses, stone structures enclosing the springs and cisterns that provided the agora's water supply, were among the few public spaces in Athens where women were regularly present. The daily task of collecting water for the household brought women to the fountain houses in the morning hours, and where people gathered for a necessary daily task, conversation followed as naturally as water follows gravity. Ancient sources suggest that Socrates was not averse to conversation at the fountain houses, and the image of philosophical inquiry occurring in this most practical and domestic of spaces captures something essential about the Socratic method: its insistence that wisdom was not the property of the wealthy or the educated or the male, but was potentially available to anyone willing to examine their assumptions honestly. The stoas that lined the agora's edges were its most philosophically significant architectural feature. The stoa as a building type, a long covered walkway, open on one side to the public space, its roof supported by a colonnade, was the perfect environment for the kind of extended, unhurried, weather-independent conversation that Socratic method required. The Stoa of Zeus. Eleutherios, Zeus the Liberator, ran along the northwestern edge of the agora, its painted interior walls depicting scenes of Athenian military glory, its exterior colonnade casting a long rectangular shadow across the open space in the morning hours. Ancient sources, including Xenophon, identify this stoa as a location particularly associated with Socratic conversation, and the physical logic of this association is immediately apparent. The stoa offered shade in summer and shelter from rain in winter. Its colonnade provided a natural series of semi-private spaces, the intervals between columns creating alcoves of relative quiet within the larger public environment. Its position at the edge of the agora meant that one could observe the full activity of the civic space while remaining slightly removed from it, a position of engaged detachment perfectly suited to philosophical observation. The archaeological evidence for Socratic presence in the agora is inevitably indirect. Socrates wrote nothing, he built nothing, he left no physical trace in the conventional sense. But the cobblestones of the agora's central space, worn smooth by centuries of feet, include the feet of Socrates among their uncountable contributors. The drain channels that carried rainwater from the agora's surface, their stone-lined courses still visible in the excavated site, drained the rain that fell on Socratic conversations, as well as on the commercial transactions and legal proceedings that surrounded them. The boundary stones that defined the sacred civic space marked a boundary that Socrates crossed daily, entering the agora's protected environment with the specific intention of engaging its citizens in the examination of their most fundamental assumptions. The law courts of the agora are particularly important in any reconstruction of the Socratic environment because it was in these spaces, or spaces very like them, that the philosophical project of a lifetime was finally adjudicated. The Heliaea, the largest of the Athenian law courts, was capable of accommodating hundreds of jurors in its open-air enclosure, its boundary marked by low stone walls, its floor of packed earth providing no comfort and no shelter from the Attic sun. The physical experience of an Athenian trial was one of exposure to the weather, to the sounds of the surrounding city, to the gaze of the assembled jurors and the watching crowd. There was no architectural mediation between the accused and the judgment of the community. The sky was the ceiling. The city was the witness. The kleroterion, the bronze allotment machine used to randomly assign jurors, represented perhaps the most remarkable physical object in the agora's democratic apparatus. Its rows of slots, each holding a bronze identification tablet belonging to a registered citizen, and its mechanism for randomly selecting which rows would be activated by the fall of bronze balls through a tube, embodied a philosophical conviction in metal. That democratic justice required the removal of human bias from the selection process, that the randomness of the machine was more trustworthy than the judgment of any individual. The Athenians had, in other words, built a philosophical argument into a bronze device and used it daily. The kleroterion is not merely an administrative tool. It is a three-dimensional statement about the nature of fairness. The water clock, the clepsydra, imposed its own philosophical discipline on the agora's legal proceedings. A terracotta vessel with a small hole near its base, the clepsydra measured speaking time by the steady drip of water from its interior into a receiving vessel below. When the water ran out, the speaking time was exhausted, regardless of whether the argument was complete. The clepsydra treated every speaker's time as equally valuable and equally limited, a democratic principle rendered in the most basic physical terms. Archaeological examples recovered from the agora retain their original markings, their surfaces worn smooth by handling, their terracotta bodies the warm color of Attic soil. The specific area near the Stoa of Zeus Eleutherios, identified by ancient sources as a favored location for Socratic conversation, has been examined with particular care by archaeologists working on the agora site. The cobblestones in this area show the characteristic wear patterns of heavy pedestrian traffic, the stone surfaces polished by the accumulated friction of countless feet over many generations. The drain channels nearby are well preserved, their stone-lined courses indicating the careful engineering that the Athenians applied even to the most utilitarian aspects of their civic infrastructure. The boundary stones that define the sacred space of the agora stand at intervals around its perimeter, their inscribed surfaces weathered but legible, their declarations of civic boundary as clear now as they were when Socrates crossed them daily. The agora was, in the most precise and literal sense, the world's first philosophical classroom. It was open to the sky and open to all citizens. Its architecture of democracy, the stoas, the council chambers, the law courts, the fountain houses, created an environment in which the questions of how human beings should govern themselves and treat each other were not abstract theoretical concerns, but daily practical realities. Every citizen who entered the agora was already engaged, whether they knew it or not, in the philosophical project of working out what justice meant in practice. Socrates did not bring philosophy to the agora. He found it there, embedded in the stones and the institutions and the daily life of the democratic city, and he made it conscious. The long rectangular shadow of the Stoa of Zeus falls across the packed earth of the central space as the morning advances. The bronze workers hammer their steady rhythm from the workshops to the south. The smell of fish sauce and fresh herbs drifts from the food vendors' tables. The fountain house murmurs with the sound of water and conversation. The herm at the agora's entrance stands worn and patient, its surface warm from the morning sun, the accumulated touch of 10,000 hands smoothed into its stone. Somewhere in this sensory landscape, a barefoot man with a snub nose and an inexhaustible capacity for questions is making his way through the crowd, looking for someone who believes they know what virtue is. Every stone in Athens was sacred. This is not metaphor. In the 5th century BCE, the physical fabric of the city was so thoroughly interpenetrated with religious meaning that to walk from one end of Athens to the other was to move through an unbroken landscape of divine presence. Shrines at crossroads, altars in doorways, sacred precincts carved from the living rock, the smoke of sacrifice rising from a dozen different locations simultaneously into the clear Attic sky. For a man who asked the questions Socrates asked, this was not merely a backdrop, it was a battleground. The Acropolis was the gravitational center of this sacred landscape, and its religious power was of a different order than anything visible from below. To ascend the sacred way toward the Propylaea in the 5th century BCE was to leave the human-scaled world of the lower city and enter a space where the boundary between the mortal and the divine had been deliberately, architecturally dissolved. The plateau's surface was not empty ground between monuments. It was a dense accumulation of sacred objects, votive offerings, small shrines, and ancient markers, the accumulated religious deposits of centuries pressing against each other in the confined space of the summit. Bronze tripods stood in rows. Marble dedications crowded the pathways between the great buildings. Terracotta figurines filled the crevices of the rock face. The Acropolis was not a museum of religious art. It was a living, breathing, continuously active site of divine encounter, its every surface charged with the specific weight of human petition and divine response. At the heart of this sacred density stood the ancient olive tree of Athene, growing within a walled enclosure on the western portion of the plateau. This was not an ordinary tree. Ancient tradition held it to be the original olive that Athene herself had caused to spring from the rock of the Acropolis in her contest with Poseidon for the patronage of the city, the divine gift that had won her the allegiance of the Athenians and given the city its name. When the Persians burned the Acropolis in 480 BCE, destroying everything on the plateau, ancient sources record that the olive tree's stump had already sent out a new shoot by the following morning, a sign interpreted as divine confirmation that Athene had not abandoned her city. The tree that grew within its walled enclosure in the 5th century BCE was therefore not merely a botanical specimen. It was a living document of divine covenant, a physical object that embodied the relationship between the city and its patron goddess in a form that could be seen, touched, and verified. Its silver-grey leaves caught the Attic light in the same way as every other olive tree in the surrounding countryside, but their shimmer carried a different weight entirely. The Erechthion, built on the northern edge of the Acropolis Plateau in the final decades of the 5th century BCE, was the most theologically complex building in Athens, a structure whose very architecture reflected the layered, overlapping, sometimes contradictory nature of Athenian religious tradition. Unlike the Parthenon's clean Doric authority, the Erechthion was irregular, asymmetrical, its plan determined not by aesthetic preference, but by the sacred obligations it was required to fulfill. It housed multiple shrines to multiple deities and heroes simultaneously. Athene Polias, the ancient olive-wood cult statue of the goddess far older than the Parthenon's chryselephantine masterpiece, Poseidon, whose trident mark was preserved in the rock of the floor, Erechtheus, the ancient king of Athens whose identity had merged with that of the sea god over centuries of religious evolution, and Hephaestus, whose forge fire was associated with the sacred lamp that burned perpetually within the building's interior. The porch of the Caryatids on the Erechthion's southern face presented the most extraordinary architectural statement on the entire Acropolis. 6 female figures, the Caryatids, served as the columns supporting the porch's roof, their bodies bearing the structural load with an apparent effortlessness that transformed the act of architectural support into something closer to sacred attendance. Their faces, turned slightly outward toward the city below, wore expressions of serene absorption, as though they were simultaneously present in the physical world and elsewhere. The technical achievement of the Caryatids was remarkable. The sculptors had to solve the engineering problem of creating a load-bearing column from a human figure while maintaining the visual impression of natural, unforced posture. But the theological statement was equally remarkable. The boundary between the human and the architectural, between the mortal body and the sacred structure, had been deliberately blurred. The building was being held up by women who were also goddesses, or goddesses who were also women, or something that the Greek religious imagination held in a productive ambiguity that no single category could contain. Below the Erechthion, cut into the northern face of the Acropolis rock, a series of cave shrines occupied the shadowed spaces where the vertical cliff met the accumulated debris of the slope. These were among the oldest sacred sites in Athens, predating the great buildings of the 5th century by centuries, their origins lost in the prehistorical religious practice of the Aegean world. The cave shrines dedicated to Pan, and the nymphs were small, dark recesses barely large enough for a worshipper to enter, their walls blackened with the accumulated smoke of votive lamps burned over generations, their floors scattered with terracotta figurines, small, roughly made objects representing the human form, left as offerings by worshippers seeking divine assistance with the practical concerns of daily life. Fertility, health, safe childbirth, the welfare of children, the success of agricultural endeavors. These were the prayers deposited in the cave shrines, pressed into the blackened rock by hands that left no other record. The contrast between these cave shrines and the marble perfection of the Parthenon above them was not a contradiction in the Athenian religious imagination. It was a demonstration of that imagination's extraordinary range. The same city that had commissioned Pheidias to create the most technically and artistically sophisticated religious sculpture, the ancient world had yet produced also maintained these ancient, smoky, intimate recesses in the rock face, and regarded both as equally valid expressions of the divine. Greek religion was not a systematic theology. It was an accumulated practice, a layered tradition in which new forms of worship were added to old ones without the old ones being discarded, in which the gods were simultaneously the cosmic forces that structured reality and the local presences that inhabited specific rocks and springs and trees. The great altar of Athene stood in the open air on the Acropolis plateau, east of the Erechthion, and it was here that the most significant sacrifices in the Athenian religious calendar took place. The altar was not a building, but a platform of accumulated ash and bone, the physical residue of centuries of sacrifice, compressed and hardened into a structure that was itself a record of devotion. On the major festival days, particularly the Panathenaea celebrated every 4 years with exceptional magnificence, the smoke from the altar rose in a column visible from the harbor at Piraeus, the entire city oriented toward this single point of divine communication. The smell of burning meat and bone and the aromatic herbs scattered over the sacrificial fire would have carried across the plateau and down into the lower city, a sensory announcement of divine engagement that reached every household simultaneously. The road northwest from Athens toward Eleusis was one of the most sacred routes in the Greek world, and its physical character reflected this status. The Sacred Way, as it was known, ran for roughly 22 kilometers through the olive-silvered landscape of Attica, passing through the Kerameikos cemetery district before leaving the city walls and entering the open countryside. Along its route, small shrines and sacred markers punctuated the landscape at regular intervals, boundary stones, votive deposits, the occasional small temple or sacred enclosure. The road itself was worn, deep by the passage of generations, its surface compressed by the feet of the tens of thousands who made the annual journey to the sanctuary of Demeter at Eleusis each autumn for the celebration of the Eleusinian mysteries. The mysteries were the most important religious event in the Athenian calendar, and their physical setting at Eleusis was of a different character entirely from the civic grandeur of the Acropolis. The sanctuary of Demeter occupied a natural hollow in the hills above the Saronic Gulf, its position suggesting enclosure and concealment rather than the commanding visibility of the Athenian Acropolis. The Telesterion, the great hall of initiation, was a building unlike any other in the Greek world. Its interior a forest of columns supporting a roof over a space large enough to accommodate thousands of initiates simultaneously. Its design oriented not toward external display, but toward the internal experience of those gathered within. What happened inside the telesterion during the mysteries was, by sacred law, never to be revealed. Ancient sources are unanimous on this point, and the silence has held across 2.5 millennia with remarkable completeness. What is known is that the initiates emerged from the experience transformed, that the mysteries offered something that the ordinary practice of Greek religion did not, some encounter with the divine that addressed the deepest human anxieties about death and what lay beyond it. The oracle at Delphi occupied a physical environment of such dramatic natural power that its sacred status required no architectural justification. The sanctuary of Apollo at Delphi was built on the steep southern slopes of Mount Parnassus, above a deep gorge through which the Plestos River ran far below. The limestone cliffs rising on either side in walls of mineral-streaked rock that caught the morning light in colors ranging from pale cream to deep ochre. The site was visible from the sea on clear days, its position on the mountain face suggesting both accessibility and remoteness. A place that could be reached by the determined pilgrim, but that announced itself, through its physical drama, as belonging to a different order of reality than the ordinary world below. It was from Delphi that the pronouncement came which set the entire Socratic philosophical project in motion. According to the account preserved in Plato's Apology, a friend of Socrates named Chaerephon traveled to the oracle and asked whether anyone was wiser than Socrates. The oracle's response, that no one was wiser, was delivered in the compressed, ambiguous manner characteristic of Delphic pronouncements, its meaning requiring interpretation rather than simple acceptance. Socrates, according to his own account, found the oracle's statement deeply puzzling, since he was convinced of his own ignorance. The philosophical project that followed, the systematic examination of those who claimed wisdom, the discovery that their claimed knowledge was unfounded, the gradual emergence of the insight that awareness of one's own ignorance was itself a form of wisdom, was, in this account, an attempt to understand what the god at Delphi had meant. The physical environment of Delphi thus stands at the origin point of Socratic philosophy in a very precise sense. The limestone cliffs, the deep gorge, the mineral-streaked rock face, the temple of Apollo with its famous inscriptions, "Know thyself, and nothing in excess," carved above the entrance. These were the material conditions that produced the divine statement that sent Socrates into the agora with his questions. The oracle's pronouncement was not made in a vacuum. It was made in a place of overwhelming natural power, a place where the boundary between the human and the divine felt genuinely permeable, where the rock itself seemed to speak. This is the paradox at the heart of the religious landscape of Athens and its relationship to Socratic philosophy. The city's sacred topography was not the enemy of philosophical inquiry. It was, in many ways, its generator. The questions that Socrates asked about piety, what it truly meant to honor the gods, whether conventional religious practice constituted genuine devotion or merely its performance, were questions that the religious landscape of Athens made unavoidable. A city in which every public space was also a sacred space, in which the smoke of sacrifice rose daily from a dozen altars, in which the ancient olive tree of Athene grew in its walled enclosure on the Acropolis, and the cave shrines in the rock face received their terracotta offerings, and the road to Eleusis was worn deep by the feet of pilgrims. Such a city could not avoid the question of what all this religious activity actually meant, what it was actually for, whether the gods it addressed were genuinely present in the smoke and the stone. To question the gods in Athens was not to question an abstract theological proposition. It was to question the very stones of the city, the smoke rising from the altar of Athene, the ancient olive tree in its walled enclosure, the worn surfaces of the cave shrine walls. It was to question the accumulated devotion of generations, the physical record of human petition and divine response that was embedded in every surface of the sacred landscape. This was why the charge of impiety leveled against Socrates at his trial carried the weight it did. It was not merely a theological accusation. It was an accusation of attacking the physical and spiritual foundations of the city itself, of pulling at the threads that held the sacred landscape together, of asking whether the smoke rising from the altar of Athene actually reached anyone capable of receiving it. The Acropolis stands above the city in the late afternoon light, its marble surfaces warming from white to gold as the sun descends toward the western hills. The smoke of the altar has dispersed into the clear Attic air. The ancient olive tree moves in the evening breeze within its walled enclosure. The cave shrines in the rock face hold their darkness and their accumulated offerings. The road to Eleusis stretches northwest through the olive groves, worn deep by the feet of the faithful. And somewhere in the city below, a man who has spent his life asking what piety truly means is approaching the end of the time available to him for asking. The sacred ground of Athens does not answer. It never has. It simply endures, stone and smoke and ancient wood, holding its questions as carefully as it holds its answers. In the spring of 399 BCE, the machinery of Athenian democratic justice assembled itself around a single man with the same methodical efficiency it applied to every case that came before it. The Cleroterion was consulted. The bronze balls fell through their tube. 501 citizens of Athens, selected by the impartial mechanism of the allotment machine from the pool of registered jurors, received their bronze identification tokens and made their way to the law court district on the western edge of the Agora. They came from the deemed districts of Attica, from the workshops and the farms and the merchant houses of the city. They were potters and soldiers and landowners and craftsmen. They were, in the precise constitutional sense that Athens had developed over a century of democratic practice, the people. And the people had gathered to judge whether Socrates of Athens should live or die. The physical environment in which this judgment would be rendered was the Heliaea, the largest and most significant of the Athenian law courts, its name derived from the Greek word for sun, a reminder that Athenian justice was conducted entirely in the open air, under the full light of the Attic sky. The Heliaea's boundaries were marked by low stone walls, their surfaces rough and unadorned, their purpose purely functional, to define the sacred legal space within which the proceedings would have binding authority, to separate the court from the surrounding agora with the same clarity that the boundary stones mark the agora itself from the ordinary city. Within those walls, the floor was packed earth, compressed by the feet of countless previous proceedings into a surface as hard and unyielding as stone, its color the warm terracotta of Attic soil baked by decades of summer sun. There was no roof. There were no seats for the jurors, who stood or shifted their weight through the hours of testimony and argument. There was no architectural mediation between the proceedings and the surrounding city. The sounds of the agora drifted freely across the low stone walls, the calls of vendors and the hammering of bronze workers, and the bleating of animals providing a continuous counterpoint to the formal business of justice. The Acropolis was visible on the horizon above the court's southern boundary, the Parthenon's columns catching the morning light with their characteristic warm gleam, the colossal bronze Athene Promachos visible above the propylaea. Athenian justice was conducted in full view of the city's most powerful symbols, under the open sky that belonged equally to gods and citizens, with no architectural shelter from the physical reality of the world in which that justice was being administered. This openness was not an oversight or a limitation of Athenian building technology. It was a philosophical statement rendered in the absence of stone. Justice, in the Athenian conception, was not a private transaction conducted in enclosed chambers by specialists. It was a public act, performed in the open air, witnessed by the sky and the city simultaneously. Its legitimacy derived precisely from its exposure to the full light of civic scrutiny. The architecture of the Heliaea was the architecture of radical transparency, a space that refused to hide its proceedings behind walls or roofs or the mystifying apparatus of specialized legal environments. The Cleroterion that had assembled the jury for Socrates' trial stood as one of the most remarkable physical objects in the Agora's democratic apparatus. The device, a bronze allotment machine whose basic design has been reconstructed from archaeological examples and ancient descriptions, consisted of a rectangular frame containing rows of narrow slots, each slot capable of holding a bronze identification tablet belonging to a registered citizen. A tube ran vertically through the machine's interior, and through this tube bronze balls were dropped, black balls and white balls in a ratio, determined by the number of jurors required for the specific case. As each ball emerged from the bottom of the tube, it activated a horizontal row of slots, designating the citizens whose tablets occupied that row as either selected or rejected. The randomness was genuine and verifiable, the mechanism designed to make manipulation effectively impossible. For the trial of Socrates, this machine had produced 501 citizens, the odd number ensuring that no tied verdict could occur. The water clock, the clepsydra, occupied its position near the speaker's area with the quiet authority of an object whose function was simultaneously administrative and philosophical. The terracotta vessel, its surface worn smooth by handling and its markings faded, but still legible in the archaeological examples recovered from the Agora site, measured speaking time by the steady drip of water from a small hole near its base into a receiving vessel below. Each party to the proceedings received a measured quantity of water, the same quantity regardless of the speaker's social status, wealth, or rhetorical reputation. When the water ran out, the speaking time was exhausted. The clepsydra imposed on the proceedings a discipline that no human official could have maintained with equal impartiality. The equality of time, measured not by judgment, but by physics. Ancient sources record that Socrates, in his defense before the jury, made no attempt to deploy the conventional strategies of Athenian legal rhetoric. He did not weep. He did not bring his family before the jury to appeal for mercy. He did not hire a professional speechwriter to craft arguments calibrated to the emotional responses of the assembled citizens. According to Plato's account in the Apology, Socrates addressed the jury in the same direct, questioning manner that had characterized his philosophical conversations in the Agora, treating the legal proceedings as an extension of the philosophical project, rather than as a separate domain governed by different rules. He spoke, according to this account, as though the clepsydra's water were irrelevant, as though the 501 citizens arrayed before him were not judges, but interlocutors. as though the question before the court were not his guilt or innocence, but something larger and more fundamental about the relationship between the individual conscience and the demands of the community. The charges against him were two: impiety toward the gods of the city and corruption of the youth of Athens. The accusers were Meletus, a poet, Anytus, a prominent democratic politician, and Lycon, an orator. Their motivations, as reconstructed from ancient sources, were complex and overlapping: religious conservatism, political resentment, personal grievance, and genuine civic concern, all apparently contributing to the prosecution in proportions that remain debated by scholars. What is clear from the historical record is that the charges were not frivolous. Impiety was a serious crime in Athens, and the corruption of youth, understood as the undermining of the values and beliefs that held the democratic community together, was equally serious. The accusers were not inventing concerns that no reasonable Athenian shared. They were articulating anxieties that had been building in the city for decades, anxieties that the comic playwright Aristophanes had given theatrical form in his play The Clouds, produced in 423 BCE, which depicted Socrates as a sophist who taught young men to argue their way out of their obligations to parents and tradition. The vote, when it came, was recorded by the jurors on small bronze or terracotta ballots, discs with a central axle, the axle either hollow or solid, indicating the jurors' verdict. The ballots were deposited into urns. The hollow-axled ballots counted for conviction, the solid-axled for acquittal. The count, as preserved in ancient sources, produced a verdict of guilty by a margin of 280 to 221, a majority of 59 votes. Had 30 of those votes fallen differently, Socrates would have been acquitted. The penalty phase followed the conviction, and it was here that the proceedings took their most philosophically significant turn. Athenian law in capital cases required the convicted party to propose an alternative penalty to the one demanded by the prosecution, and the jury would then choose between the two proposals. The prosecution had demanded death. Socrates, according to Plato's account, initially proposed that his penalty should be free meals at public expense in the Prytaneum, the honor reserved for Olympic victors and great benefactors of the city, on the grounds that his philosophical service to Athens deserved reward rather than punishment. He eventually settled on a fine of 30 minae, offered on behalf of his friends. The jury, apparently outraged by what they perceived as contempt for the proceedings, voted for death by a larger margin than had voted for conviction. Ancient sources suggest the margin for the death penalty was greater than the margin for guilt, indicating that Socrates' conduct during the penalty phase had converted some of those who had voted for acquittal into supporters of the ultimate punishment. The physical route from the Heliaea to the state prison traced a path through the western edge of the Agora and into the lower city that can be approximately reconstructed from the archaeological evidence. The Desmoteria, the state prison whose foundations have been tentatively identified by archaeologists near the southwest corner of the Agora, stood at a distance from the court that required passage through the narrow streets of the Agora's western margin, past the civic buildings of the democratic apparatus, past the boundary stones that marked the sacred space of the public square, and into the residential fabric of the lower city. The streets of this district were narrow, their surfaces of packed earth worn into irregular channels by the passage of feet and cart wheels, their mud brick walls rising on either side to a height that reduced the sky to a strip of blue overhead. The prison itself occupied a position of deliberate marginality. close enough to the agora to remain within the administrative reach of the city's legal apparatus, but removed from the civic center in a way that reflected its function as a space of exclusion rather than inclusion. Its walls of rough limestone, mortared with clay and built without the refinement reserved for civic monuments, enclosed a space that was functional rather than symbolic, a container for those whom the democratic machinery had processed and set aside. The single entrance, guarded by an iron-bound door, opened onto a small interior courtyard where the condemned were permitted to walk within the confines of the walls. A well provided water. A fig tree growing in one corner had sent its roots through the paving stones, cracking the carefully laid surface with the patient, indifferent force of biological growth. The natural world asserting its presence within the most deliberately constructed of human environments. The prison's interior rooms were arranged around the courtyard, their thick limestone walls maintaining a temperature several degrees cooler than the attic summer outside, a quality that in other circumstances might have been welcome, but that in the context of confinement carried a different meaning entirely. The cell that ancient tradition associates with Socrates' final days was small, its walls rough-hewn and undecorated, its single window slot admitting a narrow column of light that moved across the floor as the day progressed, marking the hours with the precision of a sundial. The stone ledge along one wall served as both seat and sleeping surface. The clay cup that would eventually hold the hemlock preparation sat on that ledge, empty, through the days of waiting that followed the verdict. Those days of waiting were longer than they might otherwise have been, because of a religious observance that had intervened between the verdict and its execution. Each year, Athens sent a sacred embassy to the island of Delos to commemorate the mythological voyage of Theseus, and during the period of this embassy, which could last several weeks depending on winds and weather, executions were forbidden within the city. The ship had departed just before Socrates' trial, and it had not yet returned. The condemned philosopher therefore remained in the Desmoteria through the weeks of the Delian embassy, receiving visitors, continuing his philosophical conversations, and waiting with what ancient sources unanimously describe as a composure that his companions found both admirable and deeply unsettling. The physical environment of the prison during these weeks of waiting was the environment of philosophical practice stripped to its absolute essentials. No agora, no stoas, no fountain houses, no gymnasium paths. No city sounds beyond what drifted through the window slot. No visual reference to the civic world beyond the rough limestone walls and the small square of sky visible above the courtyard. And yet, according to the accounts preserved in Plato's dialogues, particularly the Phaedo, which records the final day in extraordinary detail, the philosophical conversations that took place within. Those walls were among the most searching and significant that Socrates had ever conducted. The questions of the soul's immortality, the nature of death, the relationship between the body and the capacity for genuine knowledge. These were examined in the stone cell with the same methodical patience that had characterized the agora conversations, as though the physical confinement had concentrated rather than diminished the philosophical energy available. The architecture of Athenian judgment, the open-air court, the allotment machine, the water clock, the bronze ballots, the stone prison, was the physical expression of a civilization's attempt to render justice through rational, systematic, democratic means. It was, by the standards of the ancient world, a remarkable achievement, and it had produced, through its proper functioning, the death sentence of the man who had done more than any other to examine what justice actually meant. The machinery of democratic accountability had turned upon the philosopher of democratic accountability and had found him, by a margin of 59 votes, guilty of asking too many questions. The Attic sun moves across the open sky above the Helia's low stone walls. The sounds of the Agora continue their ancient business beyond the court's boundaries. The Acropolis stands on its limestone plateau above the city, its marble surfaces warm in the afternoon light. And in a stone room near the southwest corner of the democratic city's greatest public space, the water clock has run dry, the ballots have been counted, and the cup on the stone ledge is waiting to be filled. What a single cup of hemlock could not kill was the question itself. The execution of Socrates in 399 BCE did not end the philosophical project he had initiated in the streets and stoas of Athens. It scattered it outward across the Mediterranean world, into new physical environments that would shape and be shaped by the ideas they housed, creating a geography of inquiry that stretched from the olive groves northwest of Athens to the papyrus-filled libraries of Alexandria to the lamplit scriptoria of medieval monasteries. Philosophy, deprived of its founder, went looking for new homes, and the homes it found left marks on the earth that archaeologists and historians have been tracing ever since. The first and most consequential of these new environments was established within a generation of Socrates' death, in a grove of olive and plane trees, approximately 1 kilometer northwest of the Dipylon Gate, the great double gateway through which the main road from the Kerameikos cemetery district exited the city of Athens. The site had been sacred long before Plato arrived there, its associations reaching back to the legendary hero Academos, who was said to have revealed to the Dioscuri the location where Theseus had hidden their sister Helen. The hero's sanctuary gave the grove its name, the Academia, and gave that name, through the long centuries of philosophical transmission, to every academy, every institution of higher learning, every formal structure for the organized pursuit of knowledge that the Western world would subsequently produce. The etymology is direct and unbroken. From a hero's grove northwest of Athens to the universities of the modern world, the word carries its origin intact. Plato established his school at the Academy circa 387 BCE, following his return from travels in Sicily and southern Italy, where he had encountered the Pythagorean communities whose mathematical philosophy would leave a permanent mark on his own thinking. The choice of site was not arbitrary. The Academy's grove offered shade, water from a nearby stream, and the particular quality of light that filters through the canopy of mature olive and plane trees. A diffuse, gentle illumination that softens the harsh Attic sun into something more conducive to extended contemplation. The sacred associations with Academos provided the kind of religious legitimacy that any institution in 5th and 4th century Athens required, connecting the philosophical enterprise to the deeper structures of civic and divine order rather than positioning it as something alien or threatening to established tradition. The physical layout of the Academy, as it developed over the decades of Plato's leadership and beyond, has been partially recovered through archaeological investigation of the site, which lies within the modern Athens neighborhood of Kolonos. A gymnasium building occupied a central position, the gymnasium being, in the Greek world, simultaneously a space for physical training and intellectual exchange. It's covered running tracks and wrestling grounds, providing the same combination of shelter and movement that the Agora's stoas had offered to Socratic conversation. Covered walkways connected the gymnasium to the surrounding garden spaces, their colonnaded roofs casting regular patterns of light and shadow across the paths beneath. Garden with an altar to the Muses, The divine patrons of intellectual and artistic endeavor occupied one portion of the grounds, the altar providing a focal point for the religious observances that framed the school's intellectual activities. A small shrine where Plato's students honored his memory after his death in approximately 347 BCE marked the site with the specific gravity of personal devotion, transforming the philosophical school into something that also functioned as a place of memorial. The academy's physical environment was designed, in ways both deliberate and organic, to facilitate a specific kind of intellectual activity. The shaded walks between the olive and plane trees were ideal for peripatetic philosophical conversation, the kind of extended, ambulatory dialogue in which the rhythm of walking and the changing perspectives of a garden path seem to assist the movement of thought. Ancient sources describe philosophical discussions conducted while walking through the academy's grounds, and the physical logic of this practice is immediately apparent to anyone who has attempted sustained intellectual conversation while moving through a natural environment. The body's engagement with the physical world, the slight effort of walking, the changing sensory input of a garden path, the peripheral awareness of trees and light, and the sounds of birds, seems to free the mind from the self-consciousness that can inhibit genuine inquiry in more formal settings. The academy's landscape was not merely a backdrop for philosophy. It was an active participant in the philosophical process. The school that Plato built at the academy endured for an extraordinary length of time. Ancient sources record its continuous operation for approximately 9 centuries, from its founding circa 387 BCE until its closure by the Emperor Justinian in 529 CE. During those 9 centuries, the physical environment of the academy was continuously inhabited by philosophical activity, its garden paths worn smooth by the feet of successive generations of students and teachers, its altar to the Muses receiving its offerings through the centuries of Hellenistic, Roman, and late antique intellectual life. The school produced Aristotle, who studied there for approximately 20 years before Plato's death, and whose subsequent career would generate the second great institutional environment of ancient philosophy. Aristotle's Lyceum occupied a different physical environment entirely, a site east of Athens, near the Ilissos River, associated with the sanctuary of Apollo Lykios, where the academy's grove suggested contemplative withdrawal from the city. The Lyceum's position near the river and closer to the urban fabric of Athens suggested a different relationship to the world, more engaged, more empirical, more oriented toward the systematic investigation of natural phenomena alongside the abstract questions of metaphysics and ethics. The physical character of the Lyceum as Aristotle developed it reflected this different philosophical temperament with remarkable precision. The school included dedicated rooms for different disciplines, a library, reportedly one of the first significant private book collections in the ancient world, its papyrus rolls organized and catalogued with the systematic attention that characterized Aristotelian method in every domain. A collection of natural specimens, biological samples, geological examples, the physical evidence of the natural world that Aristotle's empirical philosophy required, occupied its own dedicated space, transforming the philosophical school into something that also functioned as a proto-museum of natural history. The contrast between the academy and the Lyceum as physical environments captures something essential about the divergence between Platonic and Aristotelian philosophy. The academy's shaded grove, its altar to the Muses, its peripatetic garden walks suggested a philosophy oriented toward the transcendent, toward the ideal forms that Plato believed underlay the imperfect physical world. The Lyceum's library, its specimen collection, its more institutional organization suggested a philosophy oriented toward the world as it actually was, toward the systematic observation and classification of physical reality rather than the contemplation of abstract ideals. Both schools were direct descendants of the Socratic tradition, both tracing their intellectual lineage to the barefoot questioner of the Agora. But they had taken that inheritance in different directions, and their physical environments expressed those directions with the clarity of architectural argument. The physical legacy of Socratic philosophy extended far beyond Athens and its immediate environs. As the Hellenistic world expanded following Alexander's conquests, the philosophical traditions that Athens had generated traveled with the Greek language and Greek culture into new environments across the Eastern, Mediterranean, and beyond. The most significant of these new philosophical environments was Alexandria, the city founded by Alexander on the Egyptian coast in 331 BCE, which became, under the Ptolemaic dynasty, the greatest center of learning the ancient world had yet produced. The Library of Alexandria, whose scale, according to ancient sources, eventually encompassed hundreds of thousands of papyrus rolls, was the physical embodiment of the Hellenistic conviction that knowledge could be collected, organized, and preserved in a single place. The colonnaded halls of the Mauseon, the research institution associated with the library, provided an environment for philosophical and scientific inquiry that combined the institutional organization of the Lyceum with the resources of royal patronage on a scale that neither Athens nor any other Greek city could have matched. The physical environment of the Mauseon, its colonnaded walkways, its communal dining hall where scholars ate together and exchanged ideas across disciplinary boundaries, its gardens and its lecture spaces, represented the full institutionalization of the philosophical tradition that Socrates had practiced in the open air of the Agora. The informality of the Agora conversation, the contingency of the Stoa encounter, the democratic accessibility of the Fountain House exchange. All of these had been transformed through the intervening generations into something more organized, more hierarchical, more deliberately constructed. The philosophical school had become an institution, and the institution required a building, and the building required resources, and the resources required patronage. The trajectory from Socrates' barefoot conversations in the Agora to the colonnaded halls of the Mauseon traced the full arc of philosophy's transformation from a practice into a profession. The Stoic school, founded in Athens by Zeno of Citium around 300 BCE, took its very name from the physical environment in which it was practiced. Zeno taught in the Stoa Poikile, the painted Stoa, on the northern edge of the Agora, its interior walls decorated with famous paintings depicting Athenian military victories. The choice of the Agora's most public and accessible Stoa as the site for philosophical instruction was a deliberate echo of Socratic practice, a conscious return to the open-air, publicly accessible philosophical conversation that Socrates had pioneered. The Stoics who followed Zeno, Cleanthes, Chrysippus, and eventually the Roman Stoics Seneca, Epictetus, and Marcus Aurelius, carried this tradition into new physical environments. The Roman Forum, the imperial court, the private study. But the name they carried, Stoics, people of the Stoa, preserved within it the memory of the Agora's colonnaded walkways, the architectural environment that had made Socratic philosophy possible. The Roman forums, where Stoic philosophers lectured beneath marble porticos, represented a physical translation of the Athenian philosophical environment into the idiom of Roman civic architecture. The forum, like the agora, was simultaneously a marketplace, a civic center, and a space of public discourse, a place where the physical infrastructure of democratic or republican governance and the practice of philosophical inquiry occupied the same ground. The marble porticos of the Roman Forum were more elaborate, more monumental, more self-consciously imperial than the painted stoas of the Athenian agora. But their function, providing shelter for extended public conversation, creating a covered space at the edge of an open civic area where ideas could be exchanged regardless of weather, was identical. The architectural form had traveled from Athens to Rome, carrying its philosophical function intact. The early Christian monastery libraries, where monks copied Platonic dialogues by lamplight, represented a different kind of philosophical environment. Enclosed, contemplative, deliberately withdrawn from the public world that the agora and the forum had inhabited. The scriptorium, with its rows of monks bent over their copying work in the dim light of oil lamps, its shelves of carefully preserved manuscripts, its atmosphere of concentrated silence, broken only by the scratch of reed pens on parchment, was in many respects the antithesis of the Socratic environment. Where Socrates had sought out the crowd, the monastery sought isolation. Where Socratic conversation had been public and contingent, monastic scholarship was private and deliberate. Yet the content being preserved in those lamplit rooms, the dialogues of Plato, the works of Aristotle, the texts of the Stoic philosophers, was the direct product of the tradition that Socrates had initiated in the agora. The monastery was, in this sense, the agora's unlikely heir, preserving through the long centuries of the medieval world the philosophical inheritance that the open-air conversations of 5th century Athens had generated. The modern archaeological site of the Athenian agora represents the most direct physical connection available to the contemporary world with the environment of Socratic philosophy. The American School of Classical Studies at Athens has conducted systematic excavations of the agora site since 1931, recovering from the accumulated debris of 2.5 millennia the physical evidence of the democratic city that Socrates inhabited. The reconstructed stoa of Attalos, rebuilt in the 1950s using ancient materials and ancient construction techniques, now houses the Agora Museum, its interior displaying the recovered artifacts of Athenian civic life. The Cleroterian fragments, the clepsydra vessels, the bronze ballots, the boundary stones, the terracotta figurines, the everyday objects of the democratic city preserved in terracotta and bronze and stone. To walk through the excavated agora today is to move through a landscape of recovered memory. The ancient stones warm in the Attic sun, the outlines of the Bouleuterion and the Tholos, and the law courts visible in the exposed foundations, the boundary stones standing at the edges of the sacred civic space, with their inscribed declarations still legible after 25 centuries. The Acropolis rises above the site on its limestone plateau, the Parthenon's surviving columns catching the afternoon light with their characteristic warm gleam. The sounds of the modern city drift across the excavated ruins, traffic, voices, the distant bells of Orthodox churches built over ancient temples. The physical environment of Socratic philosophy has been painstakingly recovered from the earth, cleaned and catalogued, and partially reconstructed, made available again to the human gaze. What cannot be recovered, of course, is the conversation itself, the specific exchange of question and answer, the moment of recognition when an interlocutor realized that what they had believed they knew was not knowledge at all, the particular quality of silence that followed a question that could not be answered. These things left no physical trace. They exist only in the texts that the monastery scriptoria preserved, in the dialogues that Plato wrote from memory and imagination, in the philosophical tradition that has been continuously rethinking and reinterpreting the Socratic inheritance for 25 centuries. But the physical environment that made those conversations possible, the stones of the agora, the shade of the academy's grove, the colonnaded walkways of the philosophical schools, these have survived in fragments sufficient to reconstruct the landscape of inquiry that Socrates inhabited, and that his students and their students and their students' students went on to create across the Mediterranean world. Philosophy left its footprint in the earth, and the earth, with the patient indifference of stone and soil, has kept it. The examined life, it turns out, leaves traces, not always the traces its practitioners intended, not always in the forms they imagined, but traces nonetheless, in the worn cobblestones of the agora, in the foundations of the academy's gymnasium, in the boundary stones that still declare the edges of the sacred civic space, where the most dangerous questions in the ancient world were first asked aloud, under the open attic sky. The hemlock plant does not announce itself. This is perhaps the most important thing to understand about it, that it grows along the stream banks and in the disturbed ground of the attic countryside with the same quiet persistence as a dozen other plants of similar appearance, its white flower clusters swaying in the Aegean breeze with a gentleness that suggests nothing of its properties, its hollow stems casting thin shadows on the limestone soil in the afternoon light. Caneum maculatum, as botanical science would eventually name it, is a plant of margins and boundaries. It favors the edges of things, the transitional zones between cultivated ground and wild hillside, between the managed landscape of the olive grove and the unmanaged terrain beyond. It grows where human order meets natural disorder, in the spaces that deliberate cultivation has not quite claimed. There is something in this ecological preference that feels, across the distance of 24 centuries, like a philosophical statement. To walk the Attic countryside in late spring, when the hemlock is in full flower, is to move through a landscape of deceptive beauty. The white umbels of the flower clusters catch the morning light with a delicacy that invites attention, their arrangement in compound clusters of smaller clusters, suggesting a mathematical regularity that Pythagorean philosophy might have found significant. The stems, hollow and streaked with their characteristic purple-red markings, rise to heights of between 1 and 2 meters in favorable conditions, creating a presence in the landscape that is substantial without being dramatic. The smell when the stems are broken is distinctive, a heavy, mousy odor that ancient sources describe as unpleasant, a rare instance in which the plant's danger announces itself through the senses. But the flowers carry no such warning. They smell of nothing in particular, or of the faint generic sweetness common to many members of the carrot family. They are, in their way, perfectly ordinary. The prison cell is returned to now, but the light has changed. The narrow window slot that admitted only the faintest pre-dawn thread of Aegean illumination in the documentary's opening hour now admits the full afternoon light of an Attic summer. A column of warm gold that falls across the stone ledge and the clay cup with an abundance that transforms the space. The rough limestone walls, which sweated with morning moisture in the cold hours before dawn, are dry now, their surfaces warm to the touch, the stone having absorbed the day's heat and holding it with the patient thermal mass of rock that has been doing exactly this for millions of years before any human hand shaped it into a wall. The scratched graffiti of former prisoners catches the afternoon light at an angle that makes it newly legible. Names and symbols, and the desperate marks of those who passed through this space and left their trace in the hardest material available to them. Through the window slot, the city of Athens is visible in fragments: a wedge of terracotta rooftop, a section of the Acropolis limestone above, the edge of a column from a nearby temple catching the afternoon sun. But the city visible through that window is not fixed in the year 399 BCE. The documentary now performs its most ambitious act of temporal imagination, layering environmental images of Athens across 2.5 millennia in a continuous dissolve that transforms the view through the prison window into a lens through which the entire subsequent history of the city can be observed. The Golden Age ruins come first, the agora in its 5th century fullness, the painted stoas and the bronze statues and the democratic machinery all present and functioning. The city at the peak of the civilization that produced both the Parthenon and the Hemlock Cup. Then the slow deterioration that followed the Peloponnesian War, the Macedonian conquest, the Hellenistic period during which Athens remained a center of philosophical learning even as its political power diminished. The city becoming, in a sense, the university town of the ancient Mediterranean world, its glory increasingly retrospective, its significance increasingly intellectual rather than military or political. The Roman period brought new monuments and new patrons. The Stoa of Attalos, rebuilt in the modern era, was originally a gift from the Attalid kings of Pergamon in the 2nd century BCE, a physical expression of the prestige that association with Athens still conferred on those who could afford to demonstrate it in marble and limestone. Byzantine Athens emerges through the dissolve as a city in which the ancient sacred landscape has been overlaid with a new one. Christian churches built over ancient temples, their brick and mortar rising from foundations of Pentelic marble. The Parthenon itself, converted into a Christian basilica, dedicated to the Virgin Mary sometime in the 5th or 6th century CE. The transformation was not merely architectural, it was theological, a statement that the new sacred order had absorbed and superseded the old one, that the building which had housed Athene's Chryselephantine statue now housed the Mother of Christ. The columns of the Parthenon remained. They were too massive and too well constructed to be easily removed, but their relationship to the sacred had been fundamentally reinterpreted. The marble that Pheidias's workers had quarried from Pentelicon and shaped with such precision now served a different divine purpose, its physical continuity carrying across the theological discontinuity like a river flowing through changed landscape. The Ottoman minaret that rose beside the Parthenon after the Ottoman conquest of Athens in 1458 CE represents another layer in this palimpsest of sacred use. The mosque that occupied the Parthenon's interior during the Ottoman period, adding its own architectural element to the accumulated history of the building. The minaret's slender vertical form contrasting with the horizontal emphasis of the Doric colonnade in a way that was visually striking and historically eloquent. The Parthenon had been, in sequence, a temple to Athene, a Christian church, and a mosque, 3 of the world's major religious traditions having found, in the same building on the same limestone plateau, a space adequate to their devotional needs. The marble endured through all of it, patient and indifferent, its mineral composition unchanged by the theological transformations occurring within and around it. The modern city of concrete and traffic that surrounds the ancient ruins today represents the most radical transformation of the Athenian landscape in the documentary's temporal survey. The urban fabric of contemporary Athens, its apartment blocks and highways and commercial districts spreading across the Attic plain in every direction from the ancient center, is a city of approximately 4 million people, one of the largest urban concentrations in southeastern Europe, its scale dwarfing the ancient city in every physical dimension. The ancient agora, excavated and partially reconstructed, occupies a protected archaeological zone within this modern urban fabric. Its ancient stones, surrounded by the sounds and smells of the contemporary city, traffic noise, diesel exhaust, the electronic sounds of mobile devices, the particular atmospheric quality of a large modern Mediterranean city in summer. The boundary stones that declared the edges of the sacred civic space still stand at the margins of the excavated site, their inscriptions still legible, their declarations of civic boundary now separating the ancient world from the modern one rather than the sacred from the profane. The Acropolis is shown across the full range of its daily and seasonal transformations, and this survey constitutes the documentary's most sustained act of environmental meditation. At dawn, the marble of the Parthenon's surviving columns catches the first light before any other structure in the city, warming from the deep grey of pre-dawn through a sequence of pinks and golds that recalls the opening of the documentary's first chapter. The same light, the same limestone, the same Aegean sky, but observed now from outside the prison cell rather than through its narrow window slot. The dawn light on the Parthenon is one of the most reliably beautiful phenomena in the Mediterranean world, a daily event that has been occurring since the building's completion in 432 BCE, and that will continue occurring long after the last human observer has gone. At summer noon, the Attic sun bleaches the marble to a white so intense it approaches the quality of light itself. The columns losing their material solidity in the full midday glare, becoming almost transparent, their shadows shorten to narrow strips at their bases. The heat at this hour is physical, pressing down on the limestone plateau with a weight that the ancient Athenians managed through the rhythm of daily life. The midday rest, the withdrawal from the open sun into the shade of the stowers, and the cool interiors of the houses. The agora at noon in summer was a quieter place than the agora of the morning hours, the sensory intensity of the full Attic sun having driven the philosophical conversations and the commercial transactions alike into the shelter of the colonnaded walkways. Winter rain darkens the Parthenon stone to a deep grey that reveals the iron deposits in the Pentelic marble with unusual clarity. The streaks and veins of mineral color becoming visible in the wet surface that are invisible when the stone is dry. The rain transforming the familiar monument into something subtly different, its geological history made legible by water. The sound of rain on ancient limestone is a sound that the Parthenon has been producing for 25 centuries, and it is a sound that connects the contemporary observer to every previous observer who has stood on the Acropolis in winter rain and looked at the wet stone and heard the same thing. The full moon of autumn casts silver shadows through the Parthenon's columns that move with the slow precision of a sundial across the plateau's surface through the night hours. A phenomenon that the ancient Athenians observed and that the contemporary visitor can still observe, the moon's light interacting with the colonnade's geometry to produce patterns of light and shadow that change continuously through the night. The silver quality of moonlight on Pentelic marble is different from the gold quality of sunlight. Cooler, more diffuse, more suggestive of the philosophical than the practical, more conducive to the kind of contemplation that the Socratic tradition valued above all other mental activities. The physical places where Socratic ideas took root and transformed the world are surveyed now with the same environmental attention that the documentary has brought to the landscapes of Athens itself. The libraries of the Hellenistic world, Alexandria, Pergamon, Antioch, are evoked through the physical character of their environments, the papyrus rolls stored in their clay jars and wooden shelves, the colonnaded reading rooms where scholars worked in the filtered light of the Mediterranean afternoon, the smell of papyrus and ink, and the particular dry quality of preserved organic material in a climate that favored preservation. These were environments designed for the accumulation and transmission of knowledge, their physical organization reflecting a philosophical conviction that the ideas contained in the texts were worth the considerable effort and expense of collecting and maintaining them. The basilicas of early Christian philosophy represent a different kind of physical environment. The long nave, the apse, the clerestory windows admitting shafts of light from above, the mosaic surfaces of the walls and ceiling transforming the interior into a landscape of symbolic imagery. The early Christian philosophers who worked within this architectural tradition, Augustine, Origen, the Cappadocian Fathers, were deeply engaged with the Platonic philosophical inheritance, and their theological arguments bore the unmistakable marks of the Socratic tradition, even as they transformed that tradition into something new. The physical environment of the basilica, with its emphasis on directed movement toward a sacred focal point, and its use of light as a theological medium, was in many ways the architectural expression of Platonic philosophy's conviction that the material world was oriented toward a transcendent reality beyond it. The university halls of medieval Europe, the lecture rooms of Bologna, Paris, Oxford, and the other great medieval universities, founded between the 11th and 13th centuries, represent the full institutionalization of the philosophical tradition that Socrates had practiced in the open air of the agora. The stone lecture halls, with their fixed benches and their elevated lecterns, their Gothic windows admitting the grey light of northern European skies, their walls lined with the carved stone of scholastic decoration, were environments designed for the systematic transmission of knowledge from teacher to student, a relationship that preserved, in its basic structure, the Socratic model of philosophical education through dialogue and questioning, even as the institutional context had transformed it almost beyond recognition. The coffee houses of the Enlightenment, those remarkable social environments that emerged in the cities of Europe in the 17th and 18th centuries, represent perhaps the most direct architectural echo of the agora in the subsequent history of Western intellectual life. The coffee house, like the agora's stowers, was a public space accessible to anyone who could afford the price of a drink, its tables and benches providing the physical infrastructure for extended conversation among strangers and acquaintances alike. The pamphlets debating Socratic virtue that circulated in these spaces alongside cups of chocolate and coffee were the direct descendants of the philosophical dialogues that Plato had written to preserve the Socratic method. The same questions about justice and knowledge and the good life, now addressed to a literate public in the vernacular languages of modern Europe, rather than to the citizens of Athens in the Attic Greek of the 5th century BCE. The Enlightenment coffee house was the agora's unlikely heir, its wooden tables and tobacco smoke and printed pamphlets performing the same social function as the agora's limestone paving and olive wood smoke and oral philosophical exchange. The documentary returns now to the agora at sunset, the golden hour light falling across the excavated ruins with a warmth and a specificity that transforms the archaeological site into something closer to a living landscape than a preserved one. The ancient stones are warm to the touch at this hour, having absorbed the day's sun and now releasing it slowly into the cooling evening air. The light falls at a low angle that emphasizes the texture of every surface, The rough limestone of the foundation blocks, the worn smoothness of the cobblestones, the carved surfaces of the boundary stones, the reconstructed columns of the stoa of Atalos, casting long shadows across the excavated ground. The air carries the faint smell of time from the hillside above the agora, the same time that flavored the honey of Mount Hymettus, the same aromatic plant that has been growing on the limestone slopes of Attica since long before the city below it existed. The prison cell receives the last ray of sunlight through its window slot. The clay cup on the stone ledge, empty now, as it was in the documentary's opening, as it has been through the long centuries since its contents were consumed, catches that final ray and holds it for a moment, the terracotta surface warming from its characteristic red-brown to a brief, brilliant gold. The rough limestone walls of the cell glow with the same warmth. The scratched graffiti of former prisoners is illuminated one final time. The iron ring in the floor, the worn groove in the threshold stone, the dry straw of the pallet, all of it briefly, perfectly lit, before the sun descends below the western hills and the cell returns to shadow. The city of Athens spreads below the Acropolis in the blue dusk, the transition from day to night occurring with the Mediterranean swiftness that makes the Attic evening one of the most beautiful atmospheric phenomena in the world. The lights of the modern city begin to appear across the urban fabric, apartment windows, streetlights, the illuminated signs of shops and restaurants, the headlights of cars moving through the ancient streets, like earthbound stars emerging from the deepening blue of the sky above. The Acropolis itself is lit from below by the floodlights that have illuminated it since the mid-20th century, its marble columns glowing against the darkening sky with an artificial warmth that is different from, but not entirely unlike, the natural warmth of the afternoon sun. The ancient question still hangs in the warm air over the marble and the stone. What is justice? What is the good life? What does it mean to know something, truly, rather than merely to believe it? These questions have not been answered in the 24 centuries, since a barefoot man with a snub nose first asked them in the streets and stoas of this city. They have been refined, elaborated, challenged, reframed, translated into new languages and new cultural contexts, applied to new problems and new circumstances. But they have not been answered. They remain, in the most fundamental sense, open, the space within them still available for the next questioner, the next examination, the next honest acknowledgement that what we believed we knew is not quite knowledge after all. The hemlock plant grows along the stream banks of the Attic countryside in the blue dusk, its white flower clusters closing for the night, its hollow stems still in the evening air. The limestone soil beneath it holds the warmth of the day. The Aegean breeze moves through the olive groves on the hillsides above the city, the silver-grey leaves catching the last light with their characteristic shimmer. The wine-dark waters of the Saronic Gulf reflect the first stars of the evening sky. In the excavated ruins of the Agora, the boundary stones stand at the edges of the sacred civic space, their inscriptions still declaring what they have always declared. The ancient stones are cooling now, releasing the day's warmth into the evening air. The smell of time drifts down from the hillside. The lights of the modern city multiply across the plain of Attica in every direction, the ancient question embedded in every one of them, in every act of judgment, every exercise of conscience, every moment when a human being pauses before acting and asks, with whatever honesty they can muster, whether what they are about to do is just. The cup on the stone ledge holds the last of the light. Then the light is gone, and the city remains, and the question remains with it, unanswered and unanswerable and absolutely necessary. The most dangerous, the most enduring, the most fundamentally human gift that one person has ever offered to the world.